What happens when your HOA decides to take matters into their own hands, constructing a bridge on your property without permission? And what if that bridge, built under questionable circumstances, accidentally collapses while they're using it? This shocking turn of events left me questioning the HOA's true intentions and their disregard for property rights. You won't believe the story that unfolded after that bridge came crashing down. The arrival of construction workers on my property was a moment that I can never forget, as it marked the beginning of an experience that would forever change my perception of the HOA and my relationship with them. It started with a few workers, showing up with equipment, walking onto my land, and starting what appeared to be a construction project. Initially, I assumed it was a routine maintenance issue that came with living in a community managed by a homeowners association, HOA. After all, these types of associations often handle repairs and improvements, particularly in shared spaces. However, as the day progressed, and I took a closer look at the situation, I quickly realized that something was not right. For one, no prior notice had been given to me. No letters, no phone calls, and certainly no discussions about any planned construction were made before the workers appeared. As a property owner, I was left in the dark. In fact, it was quite the opposite of what I expected from a professional, transparent HOA. Anytime there had been previous repairs or maintenance that involved my property, I had been informed well in advance. I was given details about the scope of work, the timeline, and in some cases, even had the opportunity to voice my opinion or concerns. But this time, there was no communication, no courtesy, no respect for my rights as a property owner. The workers, though friendly, seemed unaware or unconcerned with the fact that they were performing work on someone else's property. There was a certain nonchalance in their actions, as though this project had already been approved, and no further discussion was necessary. At that moment, it became evident that I was not going to be involved in any decisions about this work, nor was my consent required for it to proceed. The project started to take shape quickly, and it was not just a minor repair job, it was an entire construction effort. As the days went by, I watched as a structure began to rise from the ground. It was clear that this was no ordinary project. It was a bridge that would span across my land, connecting two sections of the HOA property. I was astounded by the scale of the construction. The materials were heavy-duty, and the workers seemed to be building it with the intention of making it a permanent fixture. The idea that this was happening without my input or approval felt like a violation of my rights. It was baffling to me that the HOA could take such a significant action on my property without any prior notice or consultation. The lack of communication didn't end with the absence of a notice about the project. The more I watched, the more I realized that the bridge being constructed was directly impacting my land. Not only was it taking up space on my property, but the construction itself involved digging, laying foundations, and using heavy equipment. That was certainly causing wear and tear on the surrounding area. It was impossible for me to ignore the fact that this structure was being built across my land, and yet I had not been given a single explanation as to why it was necessary or how it would benefit me as a homeowner. As the project progressed, I found myself asking more questions than ever. Why hadn't anyone spoken to me about this beforehand? What if I didn't want a bridge on my land? What if the location they had chosen for it wasn't suitable? After all, this was my property, and yet I was being treated as though I had no say in what was happening. The absence of an explanation from the HOA was both frustrating and alarming. It was as if they assumed that the decision was made and there was no need to justify it to the property owners. As time went on, I realized that I had no power or control over this situation. The fact that no one had consulted me before proceeding with the construction made me feel like I had been stripped of my rights as a homeowner. I wasn't being treated as an equal party in a shared community, but rather as someone whose opinion didn't matter. It became increasingly apparent that the HOA had assumed full control over the property and its decisions, leaving the homeowners out of the loop. This feeling of being excluded was compounded by the sheer size and impact of the project. A bridge might seem like a harmless structure at first, but the reality is that such an addition could have long-term implications for my property. Would the bridge affect my property value? Would it impact my ability to use certain parts of my land? Was there any plan to compensate me for the changes to my land? These questions were left unanswered as the construction continued without any consultation or negotiation. The workers, who were simply doing their jobs, didn't seem to notice my growing concern. It wasn't their responsibility to ensure I was comfortable with the project. That was supposed to be the HOA's duty. But the HOA was silent, and my frustration began to grow. Why had they chosen to bypass me entirely? What had I done to deserve being excluded from such a significant decision about my own property? The whole situation felt wrong, and yet I was powerless to stop it. In hindsight, it became clear that the HOA's decision to build the bridge was not just an oversight or a mistake. It was a deliberate action taken without any regard for my rights as a homeowner. What should have been a simple communication about a potential construction project turned into an ongoing, unresolved conflict. And it was only the beginning. As the days passed, the construction project continued to unfold before me, and it quickly became clear that this was no small temporary installation. The workers moved with purpose, and the bridge began to take shape, extending across my property in a way that was both intrusive and unexpected. The design was not a simple pathway or bridge. It was a full-scale structure that spanned a considerable length, incorporating concrete, wood, and metal. It became evident that this was going to be a permanent fixture on my property, with little regard for the boundaries that should have been respected. The timeline of the construction was aggressively fast. In the beginning, I assumed that the project would be completed within a reasonable time frame, as is typical with most construction efforts. However, what I soon realized was that the workers were not only working at an alarming speed, but were also doing so with little regard for the quality of the work or any interruptions to the surrounding environment. The absence of regular communication from the HOA during this phase made it increasingly difficult to gauge how much longer the project would last, or whether any precautions were being taken to ensure the safety and stability of the structure. My attempts to communicate with the workers were met with brief, uninterested responses. When I asked for clarification on the project's scope and purpose, I was brushed off. I had no real insight into what was happening, and my concerns seemed insignificant in the eyes of those carrying out the work. They appeared to be operating under the assumption that the HOA's approval was enough to continue without further input from me. The lack of transparency and disregard for the homeowner's perspective created a growing sense of frustration. I was left in the dark, powerless to influence any aspect of the project that was unfolding on my land. What initially appeared to be a small oversight, a mistake in communication, quickly grew into a much larger issue. As the structure grew, it became clear that this was not an isolated mistake or a temporary construction project. The scale and permanence of the bridge suggested a much deeper level of intent, one that was focused on completing the project regardless of my input or concerns. It was becoming apparent that the HOA had already made its decision to build the bridge without considering the implications for the homeowners directly affected by it. The workers continued to push forward, seemingly unfazed by my mounting frustration. Their pace was relentless, and before long the bridge had taken on a fully formed shape. It had steel supports, wooden planks, and a platform that spanned across the open space on my property. At this point, I could no longer pretend that this was an innocent construction effort. It had all the hallmarks of a carefully planned, deliberate decision made by the HOA without any consultation with the people whose land it impacted. This lack of consideration for my property rights was more than just a nuisance. It was an infringement on my autonomy as a homeowner. The HOA, which was supposed to represent the collective interests of the residents, was instead operating unilaterally, imposing its will without any acknowledgement of the negative impact it was having on me. I began to question the HOA's motivations. Why had they chosen this particular location? What if the bridge caused long-term damage to my land or decreased its value? And why hadn't anyone approached me before beginning this project to discuss the terms or offer compensation? As the bridge continued to grow, the sense of violation became more intense. It was not just an issue of inconvenience, it was a fundamental problem with the HOA's authority over my property. The bridge was a large, permanent structure, and, once completed, it would alter the landscape of my land forever. This wasn't just a few repairs or minor changes. This was a full-scale development on my property, one that I had no say in. With every passing day, I felt more isolated from the process, more excluded from decisions that should have involved me as a property owner. The HOA seemed to have already decided that the bridge was a necessary addition to the neighborhood, regardless of the impact on the individual homeowners. And despite my best efforts to reach out and express my concerns, I felt as though my voice was drowned out by the momentum of the project. This overwhelming sense of helplessness led me to wonder just how many other homeowners had been left in similar situations, where decisions were being made on their behalf without their knowledge or consent. If the HOA could move forward with such a significant project on my property without so much as a heads up, what other decisions had they made behind closed doors? And what else might they be planning that could impact my property in the future? As the bridge continued to rise, I realized that I was facing a much larger problem than just the construction itself. It was the principle behind the construction that concerned me. The disregard for homeowner rights, the lack of transparency, and the sheer audacity of assuming that the HOA had the authority to unilaterally make decisions that impacted individual properties. The HOA had become a force that seemed too powerful to challenge, and I felt like an insignificant part of a much larger machine. In hindsight, it became evident that the HOA's determination to complete the bridge was about more than just adding a new structure to the community. It was about control, about asserting their authority over the homeowners. The construction of the bridge was a symbol of the HOA's growing influence, and a clear message that they were willing to go to great lengths to make their vision a reality, regardless of the cost to the individual homeowners who were directly impacted. The collapse of the bridge, though sudden, was not an isolated incident in the broader context of its construction. In fact, the event itself raised numerous questions about the project's integrity, the competence of those involved, and the HOA's responsibility. The collapse, which seemed entirely unpredicted at the time, was both a physical failure and a massive wake-up call regarding the safety standards that had been ignored during the bridge's construction. It was an event that immediately called into question whether the bridge should have ever been built in the first place, and whether proper precautions were taken to ensure it was both safe and well constructed. First and foremost, the collapse brought to light the glaring lack of quality control during the construction process. From the very beginning, it was clear that the construction was moving at a breakneck pace, with little regard for the necessary checks and balances that ensure the structural integrity of such a project. The workers, who were rushing to meet deadlines and complete the bridge as quickly as possible, had apparently cut corners on critical elements such as foundation support, materials used, and engineering practices. A thorough inspection, if conducted, might have flagged these deficiencies early on, but no such evaluation seemed to have been performed. This raised serious concerns about the standards of construction that the HOA was willing to accept, especially when it involved a structure built on private property. The collapse itself was a terrifying realization of just how poorly the project had been handled. What was initially presented as a simple, necessary structure, a bridge to connect two parts of the HOA property, became a potential hazard, not only for the HOA members using it, but also for anyone in the vicinity. The sheer magnitude of the collapse was shocking. The bridge didn't just experience a minor failure, it crumbled catastrophically. The sound of wood snapping and metal bending filled the air as the structure fell apart in a dramatic fashion, landing in a heap of debris. While it may have been seen as an accidental collapse by the HOA, it was hard to overlook the fact that it could have easily been prevented had the construction been approached with the proper planning, care, and expertise. What added to the severity of the incident was the timing. The collapse happened while the bridge was in use, heightening the potential for injury. While thankfully no one was physically harmed in the immediate aftermath, the fact that such a collapse occurred during active use created a level of unease about the overall safety of the structure. It raised the question, how many other failures were waiting to happen, hidden beneath the surface of this hastily built bridge? Could this collapse have been the result of a weak design, improper materials, or simply a lack of attention to safety measures? The more I reflected on it, the more questions I had. In addition to the physical collapse itself, there was the matter of how the HOA reacted. In the immediate aftermath, the response seemed disorganized at best and dismissive at worst. Instead of taking full responsibility for the incident, the HOA initially downplayed the severity of the situation. They referred to it as an accident that could not have been predicted, placing the blame on external factors rather than taking accountability for the structural issues that were evident in the bridge's design and construction. It was as if they were attempting to avoid any sort of liability or responsibility for the collapse, which only added to my growing frustration. The HOA's lack of transparency in their response further amplified my concerns. In the days following the collapse, they were slow to provide any real information or to take immediate corrective actions. They made vague promises about investigating the cause of the collapse, but no concrete steps were communicated to me or to other residents who had witnessed the event. This lack of communication only fueled my suspicion that the HOA was more concerned with damage control than with ensuring that such a catastrophic event would never happen again. The more I thought about it, the more I began to question their competence and their commitment to the safety of the community. What was particularly disturbing was that this collapse, though described as an accident, was not entirely surprising given the lack of oversight during the construction. If the HOA had taken more care in their planning and execution, this disaster could have been avoided. It was hard to ignore the fact that, in an effort to complete the bridge quickly and with minimal effort, the HOA had put all the residents at risk, myself included. The incident was not just a failure of construction, it was a failure of leadership. The HOA had overlooked the importance of due diligence, cutting corners and rushing through a project that ultimately failed to meet even the most basic safety standards. Furthermore, the aftermath of the collapse also revealed the broader implications of this failure. The incident underscored the need for better oversight and accountability when it comes to community projects. The HOA, which was supposed to be the governing body ensuring the well-being of the neighborhood, had failed to protect its residents from a serious hazard. It wasn't just about the bridge, it was about trust. The collapse shattered any illusion of trust that I had in the HOA's ability to act in the best interests of the homeowners. In the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with the fallout from the collapse. Not only had the bridge failed, but so had the HOA's credibility. This incident, in many ways, was the tipping point that revealed the cracks in the HOA's leadership and their willingness to prioritize speed over safety. The collapse may have been seen as an isolated incident by some, but to me, it was a symptom of a much deeper problem. An organization that was more focused on completing projects than on ensuring the safety and rights of its members. The consequences of this failure were far-reaching, and it left me questioning whether the HOA had learned any lessons from the disaster or whether it would continue to operate without the necessary checks and balances. The aftermath of the bridge collapse brought an entirely new set of challenges. Initially, the Homeowners Association, HOA, responded to the incident with attempts to downplay the significance of what had occurred. Their portrayal of the collapse as an unfortunate accident seemed designed to divert attention away from the fact that the bridge had been constructed without proper authorization and had failed due to substandard construction practices. However, the reality of the situation was too clear to ignore. The HOA's negligence in both the construction and maintenance of the bridge was glaring, and it became evident that something much deeper was at play. As a property owner, I was well within my rights to question the HOA's decisions. The bridge had been built without my consent, and its collapse posed serious questions about the HOA's authority to impose such projects on residents. What's more, the bridge had caused physical damage to my property, and there was no clear indication that the HOA was prepared to take responsibility for these consequences. The damage was not just physical, it was also financial. The collapse had caused disruption to my property, and the value of my land could very well have been affected by the presence of the collapsed bridge. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a case of poor planning or bad luck. It was a significant legal issue. The first step in dealing with the fallout from the collapse was to assess my legal standing. I needed to understand what rights I had as a homeowner in this situation. After all, the HOA had constructed the bridge on my land without permission, and this in itself constituted a violation of my property rights. If the HOA had no legal right to build the bridge in the first place, how could they justify the construction of a structure that had now failed so dramatically? The collapse had not only caused physical damage, but also placed me in a position where I was left with no clear answers about how to resolve the situation. Seeking legal counsel became an obvious next step. I quickly realized that I needed a lawyer who specialized in property law and could help me navigate the complexities of this dispute. The legal battle ahead would not only focus on the bridge itself, but also on the larger issues of ownership, consent, and accountability. Could I sue the HOA for the damage caused by the collapse? Did I have a case for trespass or negligence? Was there any recourse for the emotional and financial stress I had experienced as a result of their actions? These were all questions that needed to be answered, and the only way to get answers was to pursue legal action. As I consulted with my lawyer, the situation began to take on a more formal tone. The HOA's attempt to minimize the significance of the collapse quickly shifted from an inconvenience to a full-blown legal dispute. The bridge's construction, which had once seemed like an unimportant issue, had now become the focal point of a much larger conflict over property rights and homeowner protections. My lawyer advised me to keep track of all communication with the HOA and to document any further damage or disruptions caused by the collapse. These records would be crucial in building a case against the HOA and ensuring that I could seek compensation for the damage they had caused. The legal implications of the HOA's actions began to unfold as I worked with my attorney. Since the HOA had built the bridge without obtaining my permission, they had violated my property rights. In addition, the collapse itself could be viewed as a direct result of the HOA's negligence in overseeing the construction and ensuring the safety of the structure. It became clear that this wasn't a minor issue that could be dismissed. It was a serious legal matter that required the HOA to be held accountable for its actions. The situation had escalated from what initially seemed like a simple misunderstanding to a full-fledged legal battle over the rights of homeowners and the responsibilities of the HOA. One of the key legal aspects that came into play was the issue of consent. In most situations, any significant construction on a homeowner's property requires consent, whether it's from the homeowner or a governing body such as a local council or an HOA. In this case, the HOA had proceeded with the construction of the bridge without consulting me or obtaining my explicit approval. This was a clear violation of property law, and it placed me in a position where I could potentially seek legal recourse to rectify the situation. Moreover, the failure of the bridge raised questions about the HOA's duty of care. As a governing body, The HOA had a responsibility to ensure that any projects it undertook were safe and well executed. The collapse suggested that the HOA had failed in this regard, either by choosing to rush the construction process or by ignoring basic safety standards. This negligence could be used as a foundation for my legal case, showing that the HOA had not only ignored my rights as a property owner, but had also failed to maintain the safety and integrity of the project they had undertaken. In terms of practical, legal steps, the process of suing the HOA would involve a thorough investigation into the construction practices and the cause of the collapse. I would need to gather evidence, including photographs of the damage, expert assessments of the bridge's construction, and a timeline of events. Additionally, it would be important to establish the financial impact of the collapse, both in terms of physical damage to the property and any loss in property value caused by the incident. The legal battle, while necessary, was not going to be easy. It would require time, effort, and financial resources. However, the underlying issue was not just about the compensation or the damage caused. It was about standing up for my rights as a homeowner. The HOA had taken advantage of its position, assuming that its authority over the neighborhood meant it could act without consulting or respecting the property owners. In the end, the legal process was not just about the collapse. It was about ensuring that the HOA would be held accountable for its actions and that homeowners' rights would be protected in the future. This situation had the potential to set a precedent for how similar cases were handled, making it all the more important to pursue justice. As the investigation into the bridge collapse progressed, the true intentions behind the HOA's decision to build the bridge began to unravel. Initially, I had assumed that the bridge was a simple, though misguided project to improve the community's accessibility. The fact that the HOA had not consulted me or any other homeowners seemed to suggest negligence, but I hadn't fully considered that there might be more at play. Over time, however, it became clear that this was not just a case of poor planning or oversight. It was part of a larger scheme to expand the HOA's control over the neighborhood and its residents. The first sign that the HOA's motives were more complicated than I had originally thought came during the discovery of internal documents. These documents, which were leaked during the legal investigation, contained references to property developers and future expansion plans. The HOA had, it seemed, been working closely with developers who had plans to build additional properties adjacent to the existing neighborhood. The construction of the bridge, which had originally seemed like an isolated and ill-conceived decision, now appeared to be a part of a larger plan to make the area more accessible to future developments. The bridge wasn't just a bridge. It was a tool for enabling further growth and expansion of the HOA's property, with little regard for the impact on current homeowners. As the investigation into these documents continued, it became clear that the HOA had been planning to use the bridge as a connection point to open up a new area for development. The land on which the bridge had been built was, in fact, prime real estate that could be sold to developers or used to further the HOA's influence in the neighborhood. The bridge, therefore, was not simply a harmless construction project. It was a strategic move in a much larger game to expand the HOA's control and increase its financial stake in the neighborhood. This discovery added a new layer of complexity to the situation and made me realize that the HOA's actions were driven by motives far beyond community improvement. The more I uncovered about the HOA's plans, the more troubling it became. It was evident that the HOA had been making decisions in secrecy without consulting the homeowners or even considering the long-term consequences of their actions. The lack of transparency in their dealings with developers was alarming. The HOA had been working behind the scenes to secure its financial interests, all while disregarding the rights and opinions of the very people it was supposed to represent. What had seemed like an isolated mistake was now exposed as part of a broader strategy to reshape the neighborhood in a way that benefited the HOA and its partners, not the homeowners. This revelation made me question whether the collapse of the bridge was truly an accident or if it was simply a poorly executed plan. Was the collapse an unfortunate side effect of the rush to complete the bridge and move forward with the expansion plans? Or was it the result of a deliberate attempt to force the hands of the homeowners and make them accept the changes to their property, regardless of the consequences? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the collapse might have been an unfortunate but inevitable outcome of the HOA's broader strategy. The bridge was never intended to be just a bridge. It was a stepping stone in the HOA's larger vision for the neighborhood, one that didn't involve consulting or accommodating the homeowners. In light of these discoveries, the HOA's behavior began to look more sinister. The lack of communication and transparency was not just a simple oversight. It was a deliberate attempt to push through a project that would benefit the HOA and its partners at the expense of the homeowners. This was not the first time the HOA had overstepped its boundaries, but it was certainly the most blatant. The bridge collapse, rather than being a simple accident, was now seen as a consequence of the HOA's disregard for its legal and ethical responsibilities. The collapse exposed a deeper issue: the HOA's increasing willingness to prioritize its own interests over those of the community it was meant to serve. The realization that the HOA had been acting with ulterior motives changed everything. It was no longer just about a poorly constructed bridge. It was about a fundamental issue of trust and accountability. The HOA had acted in bad faith, and its actions had put homeowners at risk. What began as a small issue, an unapproved construction project, had now escalated into a much larger legal and ethical dilemma. The HOA's desire to expand its influence in the neighborhood had led to a breakdown of the community's trust, and the collapse of the bridge was merely the tip of the iceberg. In the wake of these revelations, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the HOA. The organization that I had once trusted to manage our community had proven to be more concerned with its own financial interests than with the well-being of the homeowners. The collapse of the bridge, though a shocking event, had ultimately served as a catalyst for uncovering a much larger issue: the HOA's unchecked power and the potential dangers of allowing an organization to make decisions without input from the people it affects. The truth behind the bridge was not just about poor construction or a simple mistake. It was about the HOA's growing disregard for the rights of homeowners and its willingness to sacrifice community trust for personal gain. This experience has fundamentally changed the way I view my HOA and has made me realize the importance of holding such organizations accountable for their actions. The collapse of the bridge was just the beginning of a much larger battle to protect homeowners' rights, and it was a reminder that the pursuit of profit can sometimes overshadow the need for transparency, fairness, and integrity. The truth behind the bridge ultimately revealed the dark side of the HOA, and in the process, it forced me to confront the larger issues of power, control, and accountability that affect communities everywhere. Want to uncover more shocking HOA stories? Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more unbelievable tales.